Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into hyperbaric oxygen therapy, HBOT.
Right.
We've got some really interesting material here looking at, what it actually is, what it's approved for, and then some of the, let's say, trickier aspects around its growing use for other things.
Exactly. The idea is for you, the listener, to get a solid grasp on the evidence-based uses, but also be aware of the potential issues and gray areas with these other applications.
So you can navigate the information out there.
Precisely. Be well informed.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is hyperbaric oxygen therapy?
So the standard definition, the one used by the Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Society, that's the UHMS, it's basically giving someone oxygen at pressures higher than normal sea level, specifically 1.4 atmospheres absolute, or ATA, or even higher.
1.4 ATA. Got it. And the FDA is involved here too, right?
Yes, definitely. The FDA sees hyperbaric chambers as Class 2 medical devices, and importantly, they've cleared them for marketing for 13 very specific medical conditions.
13 specific ones. Okay, maybe we should quickly run through what those are, because that really sets the stage for what's considered, established use.
Sure. It's a good idea. So think situations with severe oxygen deprivation. Things like air or gas embolism, carbon monoxide poisoning. Sometimes that includes cyanide poisoning, too.
Okay. Serious stuff.
Very serious. Also, certain severe infections like clostridial myositis, gas gangrene, and necrotizing soft tissue infections. Flesh-eating bacteria, basically.
Wow, okay.
Then you have injuries that cut off blood supply, crush injuries, compartment syndrome, what they call acute traumatic ischemias. Also decompression sickness, the bends for divers.
Right.
It's also approved for helping heal very specific types of problem wounds that aren't healing otherwise.
Right.
Cases of exceptional blood loss anemia where transfusion is impossible. Bone infections that won't clear up refractory osteomyelitis.
Okay, still going.
Almost there. Delayed radiation injury damage from radiation therapy that shows up later, helping compromised skin grafts or flaps survive thermal burns. And finally, intracranial abscesses, infections inside the brain.
That's quite a list.
It is. And just recently, the UHMS added idiopathic sudden sensorineural hearing loss. Though it's worth noting the FDA hasn't officially added that one to their list yet.
Interesting. So that's the official FDA-cleared territory. Where does it get more, complicated?
The complexity really kicks in when you compare that definition, true HBOT, 1.4 ATA or higher with oxygen, to what's often called mild hyperbaric therapy.
Mild hyperbaric. What's that?
Usually, these involve inflatable, sort of soft-sided chambers. They typically use compressed air, not pure oxygen, and only go up to about, say, 1.3 ATA. Often they're used with an oxygen concentrator, which pulls oxygen from the air.
Ah, okay. So lower pressure, maybe not pure oxygen. And the key point is...
The key point is these mild setups do not meet that UHMS definition of HBOT.
And that's not just splitting hairs, is it? Does that difference really matter in practice?
Well, it matters a lot. It's quite significant. What's, frankly misleading sometimes is that you see studies looking at these mild treatments.
Right.
Where the actual amount of oxygen getting to the person, the partial pressure, isn't any higher than what you could get just breathing oxygen through a standard face mask at normal sea level pressure.
Seriously?
Yes. But then these studies might be presented as if they're showing evidence for real HBOT.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, the science can get muddled.
Okay, that's a really important distinction. So we have the approved uses, this defined list, and then this whole other world of off-label applications. How big is that world?
It's vast. The material we looked at points to dozens and dozens of conditions being promoted online by clinics, med spas, various groups, as treatable with HBOT.
Yeah.
But none of them are on that FDA list.
Dozens. Like, what kind of conditions are we talking about?
It's a real mix. Everything from developmental conditions like autism, cerebral palsy, to chronic illnesses like Lyme disease, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, chronic fatigue syndrome, even things like stroke recovery, anxiety, depression, traumatic brain injury. The list goes on.
Wow.
Just to give you a sense of scale, one website back in 2008 listed almost 60 centers in the U.S. offering these off-label treatments. And get more recently, at least 106 centers were found advertising HBOT specifically for Lyme disease alone.
106 for just Lyme. That's a lot for something not officially approved. What's the FDA or other bodies saying about this?
Well, they've definitely noticed. The FDA has put out warnings, pretty strongly worded, stating that HBOT has not been proven effective for many of these conditions. They specifically mentioned cancer, autism, heart disease, MS, and others.
So they're actively warning people.
Yes, and there have been quite a few complaints filed against centers making these kinds of off-label claims. The concern is people might be making health choices, potentially big ones, based on information that's, well, not scientifically validated.
And I imagine these treatments aren't cheap, especially if they're not proven. Insurance probably isn't covering this stuff, right?
Generally, no. That's a huge factor. You're looking at maybe $150 to $250, sometimes even more, for a single session in one of these private clinics.
Per session.
Per session. And these protocols often recommend dozens of sessions. So because insurance typically won't pay for off-label uses, people are shelling out thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket.
For uncertain benefits?
For uncertain and, in many cases, unproven benefits. That's a massive financial burden for individuals and families, often when they're already in a vulnerable position.
That really raises some ethical flags, doesn't it? People are spending so much, often based on hope and maybe online anecdotes rather than solid evidence.
It's a major concern. The information balance is skewed. Online, you find these powerful personal stories, testimonials. And if you're desperate, it's hard to weigh that against maybe a lack of large-scale clinical trial data. We even saw an example where a mother mentioned online that her child with cerebral palsy wasn't improving with HBOT, and she was apparently sort of berated by others in the group.
Wow. That's terrible.
And part of the problem, structurally, is that oxygen itself isn't a patentable drug. So there's less financial incentive for big companies to fund the massive, expensive gold standard trials needed to really prove effectiveness for all these other conditions.
So that creates a kind of evidence vacuum.
Exactly. A vacuum where anecdotes, hope, and unfortunately, sometimes marketing can rush in.
And it's not just about whether it works or the cost. You mentioned HBOT itself has risks. Safety has to be a factor here, too.
Absolutely critical. Look, when HBOT is done correctly by trained professionals for the approved conditions, it generally has a decent safety profile.
Yeah.
But you're dealing with pure oxygen, sometimes under high pressure. That combination carries inherent risks.
Like what specifically?
The biggest one is fire.
Fire.
Yes. It sounds dramatic, but it's a real risk. The data shows 90 reported fatalities worldwide since 1923 due to fires inside hyperbaric chambers.
90. That's sobering. I didn't realize it was that significant.
It really underscores the need for strict safety. You need three things for a fire: fuel, oxygen, and an ignition source. In a hyperbaric chamber, you obviously have a high oxygen concentration. And there's always some fuel, clothing, bedding, hairspray residue.
So the ignition source is the key variable to control.
Precisely. And most historical hyperbaric fires have been traced back to prohibited ignition sources being brought inside. Things like electronics, lighters, static discharge.
Which makes it pretty concerning when you mention seeing ads with kids using laptops inside chambers.
Exactly. It's deeply concerning. It shows a fundamental, dangerous misunderstanding of the safety regulations. You absolutely cannot bring potential ignition sources into that environment.
And it sounds like this misunderstanding isn't limited to users, maybe some providers or manufacturers too.
Unfortunately, yes. The material mentions manufacturers of those portable, inflatable, mild chambers, sometimes claiming they're safe for electronics, because they only use pressurized air with an oxygen concentrator.
Oh, that's wrong.
It's a misunderstanding of the physics and the regulations. First, the FDA explicitly prohibits using enriched air with added oxygen from a concentrator in the inflatable chambers they've cleared. They're cleared for air only, for mountain sickness. Second, even if you're just pressurizing air to 1.3 ATA, that still creates an oxygen-enriched atmosphere. Anything over 23.5% oxygen concentration increases fire risk. Pressurized air at 1.3 ATA is about 27% equivalent oxygen.
Okay, so even the mild chambers aren't necessarily free from fire risk if used improperly with oxygen concentrators and ignition sources.
Correct. The risk is lower than with pure oxygen at higher pressures, but it's not zero, especially if safety rules are ignored. There was a fatal fire in China linked to a mobile phone igniting in one of these environments.
It really sounds like rigorous safety standards and training are non-negotiable.
Absolutely non-negotiable. The National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, has detailed codes updated every 3 years. Following these is mandatory in most U.S. jurisdictions now.
And the consequences for not following them?
They can be severe. We're talking potential criminal charges like manslaughter in fatal fire incidents. And your standard malpractice insurance isn't going to cover criminal acts.
So the facility, the operators, they need to know what they're doing.
Critically important. Physicians, nurses, the technicians operating the chambers, they all need specific hyperbaric training. Organizations like the UHMS and the National Board of Diving and Hyperbaric Medical Technology set the standards for that.
It's kind of a strange irony you mentioned that maybe fewer fires happen in the inflatable chambers, partly because they often aren't delivering true HBOT levels of oxygen anyway.
It is ironic, isn't it? If the oxygen concentration inside stays close to normal air, the fire risk is obviously much lower, but then you're also not getting the theoretical therapeutic oxygen dose of actual HBOT.
Which brings us right back to those low-pressure inflatable chambers. You said they were cleared for mountain sickness.
That's the only FDA-cleared indication for those inflatable 1.3 ATA type chambers. Acute mountain sickness.
But they're marketed much more widely now.
Oh, yes. For home use, in spas, wellness centers, promoted for that whole long list of off-label conditions we talked about earlier.
And the rationale is, I mean, if breathing air at 1.3 ATA is like 27% oxygen at sea level, which you said is achievable with a mask.
Right. You can get similar oxygen levels with a simple non-rebreather mask in a hospital or even at home.
So what's the proposed benefit of the chamber then? Just the slight pressure increase?
That's often the claim, that the pressure itself, that extra 0.3 atmospheres, has some sort of independent therapeutic effect.
What the evidence for that?
It's lacking. There isn't strong, consistent scientific evidence to support that claim for most conditions it's promoted for. So you have these devices often providing minimal oxygen increase compared to a mask, being marketed with this implication of hyperbaric benefit.
And they have their own risks too. You mentioned depressurization.
Yes, sudden depressurization is a risk. Also issues like loose plastic parts inside. And tragically, there was a documented case in 2011 where a child with autism died in a home-use inflatable chamber after a valve became disconnected.
That's awful. So potentially ineffective for many uses, not risk-free, and it sounds like this confusion bleeds into the actual research sometimes.
It does, unfortunately. Because the terminology isn't always used consistently, some studies published as HBOT research actually use these low-pressure protocols.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, there was a well-known randomized controlled trial, an RCT, on HBOT for autism, but the group receiving the supposed HBOT treatment got only 24% oxygen at 1.3 ATA.
Which is less oxygen than a mask.
Potentially, yes. A good non-rebreather mask at sea level can deliver much higher oxygen concentrations than that. So the study wasn't really testing hyperbaric oxygen therapy as defined by the UHMS, yet it's often cited as if it were.
That really muddies the waters when trying to figure out what works.
Absolutely. It makes you question the logic sometimes of using a more expensive, potentially riskier chamber setup when a simple oxygen mask might deliver the same or even more oxygen more safely and cheaply.
It's a very valid point. Okay, let's shift slightly. Evaluating any treatment is tough. What about the challenges specific to studying HBOT? You mentioned a chamber effect.
Right? Think about the experience. You're going inside this, often impressive-looking, high-tech piece of equipment. There's a whole procedure, maybe noises, pressure changes in your ears.
The whole ritual of it.
Exactly. Plus, the patient's expectation and hope the placebo effect can be very powerful. Just the experience itself might make someone feel better, independent of the oxygen or pressure having a specific physiological effect.
So how do researchers try to account for that? You can't really give someone a sugar pill version of being in a chamber.
It's incredibly difficult to design a good placebo or sham control for HBOT studies. Some try using very slight pressurization, maybe just enough for the ears to pop, and playing chamber noises for the control group.
To mimic the experience.
To try and mimic it, yeah.
Yeah.
But even compressing with regular air, as the sham, slightly increases the oxygen partial pressure. If you try to counteract that by having the control group breathe air with less oxygen while under pressure, you run into another problem.
Which is?
Decompression sickness risk. Breathing normal air under pressure means your body absorbs extra nitrogen. If the control group breathes a low oxygen mix, which means higher nitrogen, under pressure, they might actually be at risk for the bends when they come back to normal pressure, especially if the pressure and time profiles aren't carefully managed.
Wow. So designing the control group is ethically and technically complex.
Very. There was actually a flawed study on diabetic foot ulcers, where the control group's sham treatment inadvertently put them at risk of decompression sickness because their pressure exposure profile wasn't safe. One patient even ended up hospitalized. The investigators might not have even fully understood the hyperbaric physiology involved.
It just highlights how specialized this field is and how carefully studies need to be designed and interpreted.
Ah.
Now, funding for research came up earlier. You said oxygen isn't patentable, so there's less commercial interest in funding big trials for off-label uses.
That's a major hurdle, yes. Without that pharmaceutical industry-style funding, it's hard to get the large, definitive studies done for many of these potential applications.
So in the absence of that definitive data, how should doctors approach using HBOT off-label? What guides them?
Well, they should always be guided by core medical ethical principles: patient autonomy, doing good, beneficence, and above all, doing no harm, non-maleficence. And a huge part of that is informed consent.
Right. Informed consent seems absolutely crucial here.
It's paramount, especially for off-label use. The physician has a real obligation to be totally transparent.
What does that involve specifically?
It means discussing all the reasonable alternative treatments, clearly explaining the scientific evidence or the lack of strong evidence for using HBOT for that patient's specific condition. Going over the potential risks, not just general risks, but risks specific to that patient, laying out the full costs involved, and, importantly, disclosing any financial interest the provider might have in recommending HBOT.
Like if they own the chamber.
Exactly. And getting all this documented, preferably in writing, is really advisable.
What about situations where a clinic is maybe using off-label HBOT repeatedly, kind of learning as they go?
That's an important point.
Yeah.
If a provider is using off-label HBOT systematically with the intention of gathering data to inform future care, essentially, conducting research, then it needs proper oversight, meaning it should go through an institutional review board, an IRB or ethics committee, for approval. And patients absolutely must be informed that they're participating in research and have the right to refuse without penalty.
That makes sense. It must be incredibly difficult, though, when you have patients or parents who are desperate. You mentioned conditions like autism or cerebral palsy.
It's heartbreaking and ethically very challenging. Families are often exploring every possible avenue, fueled by hope, sometimes amplified by online advocacy groups, promoting HBOT based on limited evidence.
How do doctors balance that desire from the family with sticking to evidence-based medicine and ensuring safety?
It's a tightrope walk.
Yeah.
You have to be compassionate, acknowledge the family's goals and struggles, but also be honest about the state of the evidence and the potential risks and costs. Sometimes, despite best efforts, conflicts arise.
Any examples of that?
There was a notable legal case where a court actually ordered a hospital, against its medical judgment and safety concerns, to install and operate a hyperbaric chamber for a child who had nearly drowned.
A court ordered it.
Yes. Despite the lack of strong evidence for HBOT in that specific situation and the hospital's concerns about safety and resource allocation, it raises really tough questions about who decides on treatments, the burden on the healthcare system, and managing expectations when evidence is weak.
Yeah, that's complex. Sadly, it also sounds like there are cases where HBOT provision crosses the line into outright fraud.
Unfortunately, yes. Unethical billing is a significant problem that undermines the legitimate uses of HBOT.
How does that work?
Essentially, some providers might treat patients for an off-label non-covered condition, but then bill the insurance company like Medicare using a diagnosis code for an approved condition.
So, falsifying the reason for treatment to get paid.
Exactly. That's healthcare fraud, plain and simple. The government has conducted investigations, starting back in 2000, that uncovered substantial amounts of this kind of inappropriate billing for HBOT.
And the consequences for providers caught doing this?
They can be very severe. We're talking potential prison time, massive fines, having to pay back the money.
As it should be.
Right. But there's also a broader risk. If fraud and abuse become too widespread, even for approved uses, it could potentially lead regulators like the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, to restrict or even eliminate coverage for HBOT altogether, harming patients who genuinely need it for legitimate reasons.
So the bad actors could ruin it for everyone.
That's the concern.
Okay, so what about the regulations around the chambers themselves? You mentioned the FDA classifies them as Class 2 devices. What does that mean in practice?
It means manufacturers need to get what's called 510(k) clearance from the FDA before marketing them. To get that, they basically have to show their device is substantially equivalent to a device already legally on the market.
And they can't claim new uses without FDA approval.
Correct. They cannot market the device for new intended uses like treating autism or Lyme disease unless the FDA specifically approves that new use, which usually requires extensive clinical trial data. Promoting off-label uses directly is a violation of FDA regulations.
Even if a clinic gets ethics board approval for research?
Even then, the manufacturer promoting it for that unapproved use can still get them in trouble with the FDA. The FDA can issue warning letters, seize equipment.
What about research itself on new uses?
For that, you typically need an investigational device exemption, or IDE, from the FDA.
And the FDA is looking at the rules around off-label promotion generally.
Yes, they're reviewing how they handle off-label promotion, partly due to some First Amendment court rulings about truthful and non-misleading commercial speech. But for now, the rules are pretty clear. And importantly, the FDA defines hyperbaric chambers as prescription devices.
Prescription devices, meaning you need a doctor's order.
Yes, which is a requirement often ignored, it seems, particularly with those inflatable chambers sold directly for home use or in alternative medicine settings. The FDA regulates the device itself, its manufacturing, and its marketing claims.
It feels like there's a real gap in tracking what's actually happening with all this off-label use, doesn't it? Are there any proposed solutions?
There is an idea that's been floated, a National Hyperbaric Oxygen Therapy Registry.
A registry. How would that help?
The concept is to create a central database to collect real-world information on how HBOT is being used, especially for off-label conditions. It'd help track outcomes, assess effectiveness in different patient groups, and potentially help the public identify providers who adhere to ethical standards and participate in data collection.
What kind of information would it collect?
Well, they need a framework to decide which off-label uses to even include. That might involve looking at, the alternatives available, existing data from animal or human studies, the risk-benefit balance, how common the condition is, public demand, and having really clear ways to measure outcomes.
And participation would require?
It would absolutely have to involve proper informed consent from patients and IRB oversight for the data collection.
Has anything like this been set up?
Not on a large scale, unfortunately. It's seen as a missed opportunity, particularly for conditions where off-label use is rampant, like chronic Lyme disease. A registry could potentially help figure out which patients, if any, might benefit and refine treatment protocols based on actual data, not just anecdotes.
Okay, this has been incredibly informative, a lot to unpack. Let's try to maybe summarize the big takeaways here.
Sure. I think a key point is definitely understanding the difference between real UHMS-defined HBOT and those mild hyperbaric treatments, which often don't deliver the same oxygen levels.
Right, and then there's the whole complex issue of widespread off-label use. It seems driven by a mix of hope, aggressive marketing, and maybe a lack of clear information, rather than strong science for many conditions.
Exactly. And we can't forget the real safety risks, especially fire, if protocols aren't strictly followed, and the problems with inadequate training or regulation in some settings.
Plus, the challenges in actually studying HBOT properly, dealing with placebo effects and designing safe control groups.
And finally, the serious issue of healthcare fraud, which not only harms the system, but could threaten access for patients who need HBOT for proven conditions.
For me, the aha moment is really recognizing just how much critical evaluation is needed when you hear about HBOT being used for something outside that core list of approved conditions. You really have to ask, where's the evidence? What are the actual risks? What's the cost? And is this based on science or hope?
That's the crucial distinction. Being able to separate the evidence-based medicine from anecdotal claims and marketing hype is so important.
And hopefully for you listening, getting this deeper understanding helps you do just that, navigate the health information landscape more effectively, especially when it comes to therapies that sound promising but might lack solid proof. So here's a final thought to leave you with. We've talked about the powerful placebo effect and the understandable desperation people feel when facing serious health issues. How do we, as a society, balance that inherent human hope and the desire for cures with the absolute need for rigorous science and ethical medical practice? What responsibility do manufacturers, clinics, and even online communities have in ensuring the information people get is accurate and doesn't exploit vulnerability? It really makes you think, doesn't it? What questions does this raise for you about protecting patients while still encouraging genuine medical innovation?
Lots to think about.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.